When I talk about postural problems, I often speak about bending and shortening. If you're not well versed in the model I'm using to make those claims, it may not always be easy to see precisely what I mean, but I think I've come up with a way to show you this bending quite clearly. When I talk about bending, I'm talking about something that is very real and visible, not something ethereal. So let's take a look, and hopefully this video will help you see what I see. The model of posture that I use, which comes from Jeando Masoero, gives us rather specific parameters for how parts of the body should be oriented. Because of that, I can take a picture of someone who's said to have good or bad posture, and I can reorient the entire picture around a specific part of the body in order to make that part correctly oriented. Then we can see how the other parts of the body are oriented or misoriented relative to that part. Let's start with just this image of a head. Does it not seem like a man looking forward? Does this look like an upright upper torso? We're very used to seeing people bent, but when parts are isolated like this, it's easier to see the leaning and bending. This is an image I find funny because it's one you'll find if you do an image search for good posture. To me, it's quite obvious that this man is pulling his head back in a very exaggerated way. I think even people who use the standard model would somewhat agree. But the standard model would say his torso looks okay. This picture is close enough to the standard model that it is used in some circumstances to show good posture. Let's first orient by the head. If I make his skull face forward properly, I have to rotate him like this. Again, this appears to be someone looking straight ahead, yet I've had to massively rotate the image to get here. Now let's orient by the ribcage. This will not be perfect because, as I talked about in the last video I put out, the ribcage becomes misshapen when it's constantly subject to shortening movements. But we can reasonably make the front of the ribcage and the lower back portion of the ribcage parallel. This image makes it clear that the torso is bent, because in order to get the ribcage straightened out, the lower portion of the torso is bent way back. The skull is still not oriented straight ahead here, which confirms that the head is pulled back relative to the ribcage. Finally, we can orient by the pelvis, by taking it out of its forward and down tilt. This reveals that the upper torso and head are massively retracted relative to the pelvis. Now let's move to this image of a woman who, to the untrained eye, probably appears to have good posture. She's fit and not displaying the supposedly common problems of rounded shoulders and forward head posture. Let's see what happens when we reorient her. Here we've made her skull face forward, and again we see the head is pulled back. Here we orient by the ribcage, and the bending should be obvious. Lastly, we orient by the pelvis. What's interesting here is that we can see the lower torso seems balanced and sturdy, but her image has to be massively rotated to accomplish this. We can do this with pictures of people with obviously poor posture, and we see many of the same things. This woman, who is said to have PPT as opposed to the more common APT, shows the massive bend associated with that posture. We can look at pictures of fit people who are used as examples of good posture, and again we see the exact same things. The problems are sometimes not quite as exaggerated, but the same problems are there. Now I do not have perfect posture, but it's only fair that I should show what we see for a picture of me. I'll start with an older picture of me, and we can see that the head is a bit retracted. The ribcage, orientation-wise, is not bad, and the pelvis reveals some real bending. This makes sense as my most severe problems were in my pelvis. In this more recent picture, we see that very little has to be reoriented. The head needs to be rotated just a couple degrees, the ribcage looks good, and the pelvis should be rotated a few degrees. There are certainly flaws displayed in this picture. As I said, I do not have perfect posture. But by comparison to the changes needed for my older picture and these other images, the reorientation needed is rather small. Anyone can reorient the parts of their body if they take the time to understand and orchestrate the movements that will accomplish such a thing. These extreme bends are formed by movements that we subconsciously make, and the unbending is performed through coordinated movements. Please let me know if these images made sense to you, or if any aspect was unclear. Leave a comment below. And if you want to know more about how you can unbend yourself, visit my website, mechanicsofpoise.com.